Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Francy Marin wash processed Colombia from Subtext Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Subtext, based out of Toronto, Ontario, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Hernandez Rodriguez Chirroso, a different wash processed Colombian coffee. And this coffee was the catalyst for this entire Subtext purchase, as this Francy Marin finished first place in the Copa de Oro competition. And given that I've had better success with Copa de Oro coffees this year, coupled with the fact that we've been wanting to revisit Subtext, it felt like the perfect opportunity to try this one out. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 60. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Subtext recipe, which is a 16.25 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, batch 207 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile of this one, once again, it was in line with our recent experiences with these Subtext coffees, which we've previously described as being a slight bit more developed than the experiences that we've had from Say recently as well. Once again, it still felt a fair bit lighter than the majority of other Canadian coffee roasters that we've reviewed on this channel as well, with the exception of September, of course. So for that reason, we will continue to align this one with being on the slightly lighter side of that medium light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was not quite what I was expecting whatsoever, as once again, it still felt a little bit more robust and intense than expected, with plenty of the heavy Colombian berry qualities to it. It wasn't particularly great off brew, as it didn't necessarily have a lot of cleanliness, but it did improve slightly as it cooled down with a very unique fruit quality that was somewhat hard to pinpoint on this first try, and best descriptor I had was perhaps grape juice, but for the most part it was an okay first impression. And the other part about this was that all three of these Subtext coffees did turn out just a slight bit more developed than I do remember from them, and I think the question that came to mind is if this is the direction that they went with these coffees, or it's just because they are washed Colombian coffees and they did want to maybe go a little bit further with them. That being said, having these experiences with all three of these coffees didn't necessarily lend to the best first impression out of any of them. This coffee definitely had the least impressive first impression, and given that it was the one that I had the highest expectations for, overall it didn't necessarily lead to the best first try. Day 26 through the Chemex, and it was already a little bit better, as it's still not quite as clean as desired, with the strong Colombian berry qualities being the most prominent and intense, as this coffee was pretty intense once again. Plenty of brightness to go alongside it, as it felt like the coffee might shift from here, but there really wasn't too much to take away from these first couple of impressions. It really did seem to skew pretty heavily in two specific directions, a lot of those heavier, darker Colombian berry qualities to it, and a little bit of uneven brightness, and those were kind of the two dominating factors of it. Day 29 through the UFO Brewer, and the coffee is a bit more reminiscent of the first experience, as it's a little bit all over the board, lacking particularly in clarity. More of the prominent heavier berry qualities to it, and the acidity a bit more uneven. While tropical, it is lacking definition, so I definitely felt some adjustments were still needed. It is worth noting that at this moment I had heard from a fair bit of other people that they were also struggling mightily with this coffee, especially on these earlier days. So it wasn't just us. This coffee really didn't seem to work well with our standard recipe to it, and I felt like heavier adjustments were going to be required to really help this one improve. So on day 32, we did opt for the V60 with Subtext recipe. That's standard. We go with the roaster's recipe after trying with our standard recipe, and it was a little bit better today, as it's best coming off brew. But it didn't cool down particularly well this time, as off brew there's a slight bit better cleanliness to it, a little bit of a melon-like quality in line with the listed honeydew, but it loses its structure as it cools down. Very syrupy, very heavy, and even a bit bitter in terms of a slight grapefruit-like sense. So really didn't enjoy that experience of this coffee. We'll go ahead and move on to day 35, as we opted for the Chemex with Subtext recipe, and the coffee is a little bit better today, as it's not quite as heavy, and that's a win for us, given that this coffee was just so heavy up to this point that having that toned down even slightly definitely did seem to help. It has been a bit inconsistent as it's unknown whether the coffee is just falling off or it's just finicky in general. Heavy syrupy tropicality remains extremely dominant to this one as well, so just continuing to struggle with this coffee overall. This one is, of course, a pink bourbon coffee, and historically speaking, I've heard that pink bourbon coffees can fall off a bit quick, but it would be extremely strange for a coffee to fall off before the day 22 mark, before we even started brewing this coffee. I really honestly didn't know what to make of this experience. So on day 38, we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and it didn't help this coffee whatsoever, as it continued to have a surprisingly high savory quality that was also reminiscent of tomato, so I was getting even less desirable qualities to this one. More of an uneven brightness as it's overbearing without great focus or definition outside of that. So this day was a pretty significant fail for us. And on day 41, we said, okay, well, at the very least, we'll go back to Subtext recipe. Slightly higher extraction adjustments seemed to be working better for us. And it was actually the best that it had been to this point. And it's at this moment this coffee took a very significant shift from where it had been. While it's still offering a slight tomato-like component, the heaviness is significantly toned down and there's a much more tame and even berry feel. So I felt like this was better overall, largely because this coffee was significantly more balanced. And it was really as of this moment that this coffee just completely seemed to shift, as on day 45, we opted for the Chemex with Subtext recipe one more time. And the coffee was the best it had been by a significant distance. And strangely enough, here on this day 60 mark, coffee is actually a little bit better than it had been even on this day 45 mark, as it is offering plenty of qualities ranging from a tart berry-like characteristic to it, melon qualities, and an interesting fresh nectarine, what I described as a fresh nectarine with vanilla yogurt-like feel, as well as some of those savory qualities to go alongside that as well, a very slight tomato-like characteristic, but for the most part, significantly more depth. And that definitely did seem to help given the extreme struggles that we had had up to this point with this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel. Swap tasting wheels. There you go, so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have one level 5. Let's go through that one real quick, and that is the finished level 5. I remember very well when making this tasting wheel that I'd originally put it at that level 4 mark, but I thought about it as I took a sip and said, this finish just seems to be lasting an extended period of time. So we actually went back, changed that, put it at a level 5. It does have a very long lasting finish to it. And I'm glad that it became a bit more balanced, as on the earlier days, it had a combination of things, uneven brightness, a very heavy, intense tropical quality to it, all of which were in a very intense and long lasting pronounced finish. So level 5, it's been consistent throughout the entirety of it. I think what really seems to benefit it now is that it's presented in a much more even sense. So I don't mind the finish being as high as it was, but on the earlier days, it was a pretty rough go of it as well. A lot of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Up until the last 2 days, it would have been a miracle for this coffee to reach level 4. It was barely there at the level 3 mark, if I'm being completely honest, largely because of just how heavy and uneven this coffee was overall. But towards the end, finding a little bit of definition to a lot of the characteristics within this coffee certainly seemed to help. I would say it's probably on par with the Alegria Munoz Ortega in terms of cleanliness, but if anything, maybe a little less so, slightly lower side of the level 4. But I really didn't want to knock it too much, largely because we were able to get some really nice characteristics and definition to this coffee towards the end. Sweetness level 4. I had my skepticism as to whether or not this coffee was ever going to be sweet. It was just so bright, tart, and uneven and heavy in the tropical berry sense that it was just going to take a lot for this coffee to have some nice definition to the sweetness. And by the end it did, especially in terms of the fruit qualities to it. So level 4, where we opted to put that, I'm actually very happy that it ended up scoring there. Acidity level 4, I know that's going to be one of the bigger selling points to people in this coffee. On certain days it was at the level 5, largely because it just didn't seem to offer a lot of definition to it. But it definitely did offer some characteristics that were quite reminiscent of Kenyan coffees, and I feel like that's probably why it ended up winning the Copa de Oro competition, because I affectionately joke that that competition is a competition to see which coffee can taste the most like a Kenyan. And this one certainly did on a number of days. So level 4, where we opted to put that, a lot of brightness to this one, not really surprising. Florality, level 4, and I didn't really jot down or take any significant notes on the floral qualities of this coffee, but given that there's a fair bit of that vanilla-like characteristic to that, I can certainly see it. The red tint to this one can also offer something like a hibiscus characteristic. There wasn't too much of an herbal quality to it, even then, plenty of Kenyan-like components, so for that reason, I can see the florality being a little bit higher in that regard. Berry fruit, level 4, and I'm trying to remember exactly what they had. I think melon is probably the biggest and most defining berry fruit characteristic that they do have. I could see that, but again, darker berry. I mentioned grape on some of the earlier days, and as I'm kind of thinking about that, that's probably the best description for that really heavy dark berry quality that is quite abundant within so many Colombian coffees. So level 4, where we have to put that thing, definitely thinking of a darker grape component in it as well. Citrus fruit, level 4, and again, it's kind of more intense citric quality to it. Looking through the notes here real quick, I don't think that they had any specific citric note on here whatsoever, but given that there's a very strong level of brightness to it, it says generic tropical fruit. Also, it also says floral, which I don't necessarily think that we had something that we wanted to just define as being specific on that either. Regardless, citrus fruit, level 4, I can definitely see a little bit more of some, given just how bright it was, thinking something along the lines of a pineapple, but in terms of more of the brightness of anything. Stone fruit, level 3, we'll go ahead and move on to level 3s real quick since we're already here. And I mentioned that nectarine-like characteristic to it, definitely towards the end, and that gave this coffee a significantly better result than what we were experiencing earlier on. So happy with that being there at the level 3 mark. Savoriness, level 3. Surprising bit of tomato to this one, especially towards the end, and that just goes along with a lot of the other characteristics that we were getting on the later days of this coffee. And then final thing we're discussing, body, level 3. It is funny that they do have a juicy descriptor on there, given that I mentioned this coffee can at times be a bit Kenyan-like. It's a nice combination of two qualities of coffees that I don't necessarily love. The savory, really bright characteristics of a Kenyan coffee, and then the darker berry, heavier qualities of a Colombian coffee. So that's kind of the results that we got in this one, and that did translate to the body itself. So as I'm looking at its tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I really don't know what happened towards the end of this one, but it did take a very drastic shift. I felt like a lot of people gave up on this coffee pretty early, largely because the early results of this one were quite difficult, if I'm being completely honest. I didn't have a lot of faith or optimism that this coffee would improve the more we worked on it, largely because the early results were just so tricky and difficult, and I was not finding a lot of potential with this coffee that I really didn't see a way that this coffee would turn out as nice as it did. And even towards the end, as I kind of mentioned, it skewed in a lot of directions that I don't particularly enjoy. Largely the very intense sort of brightness that was presented within this one, the heavier, darker berry qualities to it, and even then just the slight savoriness that was presented here. So nice combination of two very distinct traits of two very distinct origins, neither of which I'm a particularly big fan of. It was redeemed, though, by the very nice stone fruit quality and characteristic, and the sweetness that I was able to get towards the end. Also the cleanliness, which by a miracle did end up reaching that level 4 mark. But I'm just so unbelievably curious to hear what others got and felt from this coffee, largely because the early impressions were just so negative from what I had heard that I don't know if anybody was able to get the nice results that we got towards the end of this one, but this one was just a bit of an enigma. We left it for last largely because it was the focal point of this series of reviews from Subtext that we do have, but it's the one I was definitely the most curious to hear any sort of feedback on. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, as I've continuously mentioned, two very distinct camps when it comes to origins. So we'll start with the focus on the Kenyan-like characteristics. It is bright, it is savory, it does offer some very abundant berry qualities to it as well. And on the other side of that spectrum, it does offer that heavier, darker Colombian berry characteristic, that very abundant grape quality, both of which presented in a more medium, heavier bodied texture to it, and a very intense sense throughout the entirety of it, with plenty of tropicality as well. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Francy Marin wash processed Colombia from Subtext Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.